Hey, this is Mark Robertson from Ragamuffin Band, and you're listening to Between the Songs.
Welcome to Between the Songs podcast.
Well, that's something you don't hear every day.
That's the thing. We are happy to offer this episode to you in celebration of the 25th anniversary of the Jesus record. If you're a Rich Mullins fan, you know what that is. You know, we decided to break our silence, to break not doing episodes because of this special reason. And really what it comes down to is our love of this particular album and its iconic status. But also, Joe, we're offering something here that no one's ever heard before. What is it?
Okay, so here's the thing. I've been doing this other show. I've been moonlighting over on YouTube on Ragamuffin Archive on Sunday nights doing this show called Ragamuffin Archive Revisited, where I've basically on a whim a couple months ago, I started digging into the stuff in our archives and elsewhere that's out there, that's available on the internet, rare Rich Mullins recordings, just some of this really cool Ragamuffin stuff that is available. And what I started realizing was a lot of people, I assume they've heard it all by now. Like I assume every Rich Mullins fan has heard everything that's out there. And I notice I still get comments on YouTube from people, you know, on videos that are 11 years old, and I'll get a comment from somebody who's never seen it before and how great they think it is. And some of the old stuff even still has like really low view counts, maybe, you know, 1,000 views in over a decade. And I'm thinking to myself, you know, I think the problem is there's all of these like hour-long, 2-hour-long videos, and nobody has the time to sit and listen to it all. So I thought what I'm going to do is I'm going to start curating a playlist of stuff every week. And I'll do a show on Ragamuffin Archive and just an hour, and we'll play different songs and different interview clips from Rich and different artists that are kind of, you know, in the Mullins verse, so to speak. And so I was doing that, and then you did a show with me a few weeks ago. We did the 4th of July show, Rich Mullins in America, and I knew that the 25th anniversary of the Jesus record was coming up. Actually, as we're taping this right now, Chris, it is the 25th anniversary of the release of the Jesus record today, because we're taping it on the 21st. So I wanted to do something to mark that occasion. And so as I was preparing, I knew that we had interviewed 6 years ago, we had interviewed Mark Robertson, Ragamuffin Band bass player Mark Robertson. And he had a new album out at the time. You remember that, Chris?
Yeah, I remember it. I have it on vinyl, but why can't I remember the name of what's he call himself?
It was the self-titled record of his band Prayer Flags.
Oh, of course, Prayer Flags. I really enjoyed that record. Cool album cover too.
It's a great record. Yeah, it's a very cool album cover.
Mark Robertson, he does so much, right? You know, in some ways, he is like a consummate session traveling, you know, bass player. He plays for the Eskimo Brothers, played for other bands. He does a lot of studio work, but then he's a dabbler, and he has all of his own creative, juices always flowing and stuff. He's had some other projects, like he has like a kind of an ambient, you know, bass synth project that he's worked on as well.
A Snipe Catcher. Yeah.
It's
his electronic side project.
Yeah, and then there have been some rumors that This Train might be recording, or they've been writing some songs together, you know, and the rumors have come from him. So it's his fault if we're going to spread this rumor around.
Is it even a rumor if they actually posted it on the official This Train Facebook page?
Yeah. And I can imagine the masses, the hordes of people that are pounding down his door for that record. All 12 of us.
It's going to be This Train mania. I'm telling you.
Yeah, this will be the one. This will be the album that finally breaks them, right?
It's going to be like the beginning of A Hard Day's Night.
Yeah, exactly. They'll be touring with Coldplay and Taylor Swift soon. I just know it.
I'm telling you. So we taped this interview with Mark Robertson, and we released a good chunk of that interview 6 years ago on this podcast. But I knew that we had more that we never aired. And so I remember talking to him about the Jesus record, and for one reason or another, we never released that stuff because we had other plans that we've clearly never gotten around to. But we had other plans at the time, so we didn't release the whole thing. And so I remember chatting with him a bit about the Jesus record, and I thought, well, I'll go and I'll find it, and maybe I can find a clip to use in this Jesus record special for the other show that I'm doing on YouTube. And so I pulled out the file, and I had to really dig and find it, but I found it. And Chris, our interview with Mark Robertson was 3 hours long. And I didn't realize that. And I didn't realize how much stuff we had never released. And so as I'm listening to it, I'm finding, well, this is a good clip. I can use this. And I'm like, oh, no, but this is a good one. I can use this too. And I just keep finding all this great stuff. And I thought, well, I think I know what I got to do. I think I'm just going to have to air a good chunk of this interview on my YouTube show. But then when I was done, editing and mixing it all together, there was still an hour of conversation left that nobody had heard because we had released like 90 minutes of it a few years ago. And now I just released another 30 minutes of it. We still had like an hour left. So we started talking about what do we do with this other hour? And we just decided to do this episode right now. We're going to release the rest of the interview that nobody's heard. And so full disclosure, like there is about 30 minutes in this today that if you've listened to the other show, you have already heard. I'm not cutting that out because just the way the conversation flows, because it was like I used the middle portion of this in the Ragamuffin Archive Revisited Jesus record special, and it didn't make sense to cut out the middle of our conversation. It's kind of the meat and potatoes. It's the glue that keeps the rest of it holding together. So what we're going to do is we're presenting an extended version of the interview that I released on YouTube. A much longer extent. This is like the Peter Jackson extended edition. This is an hour longer version of that interview. And now if you go back and you listen to the interview that we did 6 years ago and released on the podcast about prayer flags, and then you listen to today's episode, you'll have finally heard the whole thing.
And I'm looking forward to hearing it too, because I recorded this 6 years ago and I don't remember it.
And it should be noted that, yes, even as we're talking right now, Chris has not heard it in 6 years. And I only heard it for the first time in 6 years this week. And so there are a couple things we should mention. The audio quality, it ain't great. If you listen to the 30 minutes of it that we used on the other show, then the quality isn't perfect. In fact, I had to go back and listen to part one to see how it sounded. And clearly I had recorded my voice separately and mixed it all together, but I don't know where all that stuff is. I found the recording that you made, Chris. And so you sound great. And Mark and I sound kind of crappy because we're on the phone. So, and we both sound like we're on the phone and you sound like you're right there. But, who cares? It's a great conversation, and Mark really tells some great stories. And so, as you're listening for the next 90 minutes, just try to get past, the audio quality. Every once in a while, you'll hear what sounds like maybe you hitting your microphone against something. But it's good stuff, and so I hope people enjoy it. And so, should we get into it? Is there anything else we should mention? Well, you know what? There is one thing we should mention, Chris. And that is the fact that it is the 25th anniversary of the Jesus record. I shared, my feelings on that this week on the other show, so I don't think people need to hear me yet. But I wanted to ask you, after 25 years, any thoughts or reflections looking back on that album and its importance to the legacy of Rich Mullins and just to you personally?
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. You said the release date is today, and it's July 21st. But I remember holding it in my hands early in July at Cornerstone Music Festival. And I can't guarantee what was going on or how they did it, but I just knew that they had released it there. And so they must have had some special deal, like at maybe some music festivals and stuff where they were actually, able to release it there in kind of a semi-unofficial capacity. And, it had been a year since he played there, one of his last concerts. And I just remember sitting around a campfire with a friend and her name is Allie, and she really loves Rich Mullins too. I haven't spoken to her for years, but we're just kind of holding it and just kind of like being amazed that it existed. And I have to admit, wondering, like, am I going to be disappointed by this? Like, what am I going to think about it? Right. Like, this is too much. There's too much writing on this album. Like, I didn't even know what to expect or what to think necessarily. And maybe I'd heard a few songs, like, My Deliverer had maybe already come out. I'm just trying to remember like how the pre-release went.
Yeah, My Deliverer, I believe, was released in June as a single to radio.
Yeah, so I think that had probably already started to permeate. What I can't remember though is had I heard the demos, right? And I guess maybe my reflection. And this is just kind of amazing how music works. These songs from the Jesus record are still with us in the sense that they're still, permeating our consciousness. They're still working their way into our hearts. As a kind of a somber example of that, I am helping to semi-lead and officiate a funeral for a friend that died recently. And it's coming up this weekend in a couple of days here for me. And his family said, he whenever he was in trouble, he would listen to Rich Mullins. And one of his favorite songs is Hard to Get. And they actually asked me to sing it at the funeral. And it's just a really special thing. It's really an honor. And that song, as an example, is just such a gut punch of a song. It is about so many things all at once. And what's interesting is I can listen to that song and I think about Rich Mullins and his walk with God and his relationship with God. I can do that and think about my own relationship with God. But now I can do it and think about my friend. And I'm actually hearing the lyrics in a new way that I'm like going, oh my goodness. Yeah, this is how my friend heard this song. I understand it in a different way now. And that's the kind of, I guess, the songs on that album are remarkable. I mean, here's what's really weird about this. I don't know what you talk about on your YouTube episode, but that album is a mixture of old and new. And so, like, there were some songs on there that were like 20 years old, right?
Yeah. Jesus and Heaven in His Eyes were both written in the 70s, or at least partially written.
And do they pack any less of a punch than the other ones? No, they don't.
Not at all.
And do they sound sonically that different? No, it's just such a strange thing.
Well, in fact, one of the things that I did talk about is, and we talked about this with Mark in the interview. There's always been that sort of like debate of, the album versus the demos. And traditionally speaking, you have been more of a Jesus demos guy, and I'm a Jesus record guy. Over the years, the one thing I've noticed among the Rich Mullins community, even from people that are somewhat, and I'm not saying you are, but there are people who are critical of the album. Even from the people who tend to be somewhat critical of the record and say, oh, it's overproduced, or it's this, or it's that. The song Jesus, Ashley Cleveland's version, tends to be one of the most praised songs on the album. That song is one of the ones that Rich wrote the bulk of that song, like in 1976, I think it was. So you ask,
exactly.
Does it pack any less of a punch? In some cases, it maybe packs slightly more of a punch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So there you go. Those are some of my thoughts. I mean, I would probably say from the Jesus record, my favorites are, I just love Phil Keaggy's version of All the Way the Kingdom Come. I don't know. There's just something about that one that's probably my favorite. And then I like My Deliverer. I mean, I like Rick's performance of My Deliverer. I think it's amazing. and the problem with the Jesus demos, there's a significant lack of like orchestras. Like, couldn't Mullins afford the strings on the demos? I mean, what was going on with that?
There's also a significant lack of piano tuning on the demos.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, exactly. I know, right? But Mark probably gets into that, doesn't he? Like why that is, and like some of the story behind those demos, which is it's a whole ironic thing, isn't it? Like why we have the demos as they were, as opposed to something a little more professional.
He does talk about the demos, but I think he talks more about his feelings about the demos and their inclusion on the record and why they included them. I don't think we actually mentioned the fact that like Mark was next door recording an album in an actual recording studio.
Like a few of the This Train albums were like recorded in. So we know what they sound like. Mitch's, album.
Canticle of the Plains was recorded there. And
then Rich goes and does some of his best songs he ever wrote on a little, cassette deck.
Mark actually said to him, "Hey, Rich, why don't you, record the demos? You're here. Here's a microphone. Let's roll tape, go to town." And, Rich is just like, "Nah, I'm going to go to Kmart and buy a crappy boombox." and so over the years, there's all these people saying well, man, I wish they would just taken the demos and made the album out of that, which is not practical. The demo quality isn't good enough. There's a lot of issues with those demos. If you were going to try to it's not Free as a Bird, or the Beatles were there's a lot of issues here with those recordings. And it took a lot of work for them to even be able to use part of one song that they did, on the album, that Where I Am. It was never going to happen with all the demos. And I still see that to this day, people saying, they should just take all the demos, use AI to rip the music off and have the band, make a record around those vocals. Honestly, I don't think that record would sound very good. But that's not Mark Robertson's fault. That's Rich Mullins' fault. Because Mark Robertson tried to get him to record it in his studio, and Rich is like, nah.
Well, there you go. I'm looking forward to revisiting this with Mark, and Mark is always. I'd love to have more conversations with him. So we're really happy to be able to offer this for everybody, and do your own reminiscing, your own reflection, and also allow the songs to speak anew. I would say, listen to the Jesus record or demos with some fresh ears.
Okay, so to our listeners, you're going to no doubt be best remembered for your work with Rich and a Ragamuffin Band and maybe with This Train, but probably overall, you might be best known for your work with legendary Shack Shakers. I checked out your Wikipedia page because I wanted to see if you had a Wikipedia article, and sure enough, you do. And what was incredible to me was that Rich Mullins isn't even mentioned in your Wikipedia page, which is kind of amazing when you think about kind of the sort of shadow of his that has sort of loomed over so many of the people that have worked with him in his band or just even been connected with him in so many ways. But you really, I think that's a testament to the career that you've really forged for yourself in the years since then. But it really didn't touch on your CCM years at all. And you have kind of a deep history with CCM, kind of going way back to the Altar Boys in the early 80s. Kind of take us back to those early days. I know you were kind of always on the fringe of CCM, but how did you kind of find yourself in that scene in the 80s and 90s?
Well, yeah, as far as the Wikipedia page goes, I didn't do that page, and I've never edited it. I just recently found out there was one. So whoever did that must be their understanding of what I've done, you know what I mean? But I think, in the very early 80s is when I first kind of found some faith, and I saw the Altar Boys, and it kind of, you go like, oh, you can integrate the two, you can put it into the yard. And then I just kind of got known in those circles. So, I think it started with a band called Brighton, who did really we have one record on MCA that never came out, and that's probably a good thing. And then we signed with a Christian label called Pachyderm, and that record did come out. And then at the same time, I was playing bass for the Altar Boys, and I was playing for a band called Allies, doing some touring with them. And then John and Dino Elefante started bringing me in for session work. So I think I just got established in that scene, playing on other people's records. And, your name pops up enough and people go like, oh, who's this guy? And then when I moved to Chicago, it jumped right in with Caesar Kalinowski and Wonderland Records in the, early 90s. And I don't know how many records I did with him. As far as session work, I don't know, 20, 30 records. And I produced probably 5 or 6 records for that label. And that doesn't even count This Train, which was starting then. I've been making demos under the name This Train since probably 84. And I never really did anything about it until I probably had 75, 80 songs written before I really told anybody I was a songwriter. And I'd show a few things to friends in other bands that they would, they're like, yeah, that sounds like that crap you like, or whatever. They didn't seem to take it that seriously, but I thought it was decent. And then when I met Jordan and Chris Wickless, the original drummer of this train, they encouraged me. It's like, no, your voice is cool. It's just weird, and I started getting more comfortable with that. And then, that ties into touring with Rick Elias, which is what ties into Rich Mullins, because Rick is really the one who put me in front of Rich. But at the time I met Rich, he didn't know or care about me one way or the other. It's just he needed a bass player in the Ragamuffin Band. And Jimmy and Rick were officially in the band, and they let them pick the rhythm section. So Jimmy picked Aaron Smith, Rick picked me.
So you were touring with Rick prior to that then?
I was. When I first moved to Chicago, gosh, we did this death tour. It was probably 4 months or more, making comically small amounts of money in a minivan opening for Margaret Becker. Margaret had a real good thing going at the time, and she's an awesome person. But some of those gigs included opening for Rich, and that's how we got to know Rich. And it was just fun. You meet this kind of real weird dude, and you feel a little less weird all of a sudden, and a little less like an outcast. And we, found out we liked a lot of the same books, like maybe A Prayer for Owen Meany. That was on Rich's list as well as mine, as well as Rick's. And then maybe Confederacy of Dunces. Then you get into stuff like Chesterton, the more sort of weighty stuff, Chesterton and Karl Barth and people like that. But it was fun to see somebody who went a little more esoteric with things,
Well, we definitely want to get into some of the meat and potatoes of your time with Rich Mullins. You mentioned kind of how you got started with the band, Rick brought you in. One time I heard you suggest that you and Rich didn't get off to the best start, that I guess he wasn't a big fan of kind of your brand of humor. What was your relationship like in those early days?
Well, I think as anybody would tell you who was really close to Rich, there was an odd test period. He didn't trust people naturally. It didn't come naturally to him. It's weird because once you're on Rich's team, you're on Rich's team forever. So to him, you had to meet certain criteria before you could get on the team, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So Rich he took what I saw as my strengths, and I don't know if he saw them as my weaknesses, but he poked at them to see if I could take it, if you know what I mean. He was just messing with me, as it turned out, because he basically, after the first tour, he barely spoke to me ever. And if he did, it was kind of like mean, in a jokey way. Now, years later, he said, the reason I never talked to you and Aaron hardly at all is because you guys were the only ones that came in prepared. You knew all the songs. There was nothing to talk about. Because I had to keep on the other guys, so I had to talk to them more. That would be his excuse later. But I think you just have to pass a certain test with Rich. Because he told me I was like the least funny person he'd ever met. He goes, I know you think you're funny, you're not at all, blah, blah, blah. And I know he's messing with me, so I stand my ground. But it wasn't 6 months later. He's like, he calls me from Window Rock, and he's laughing his tail off, going like, I'm listening to your record, the first This Train record. He goes, you're really, really funny. He was just laughing his butt off. He goes, yeah, I just put it on. He goes, honestly, I put it on just so I could tell you I listened to it and I wouldn't be rude. I was assuming I would hate it. So I was doing it. He goes, I was even doing it while I was vacuuming, so I wouldn't have to hear it that well. And I get that. We get demos and records from bands all the time, and they can't all be good.
Yeah.
So he listened to it, and he's like, how did you do this record? What did you do? And so we borrowed equipment and set up in a basement. And since then, we bought a little bit more equipment. Every time we got a budget for a record, we dumped it into equipment. And he was like, I want to make a record in your basement. And it was Canticle of the Plains. And I'm like, oh, we don't have a basement anymore. We rented a couple office spaces out in the suburbs. And he's like, fine, whatever. But I want And he wound up spending a fortune on that record at our rinky-dink little studio, just flying in everybody, all the guest singers and all. I don't know if how aware you are of that record.
Oh yeah, very.
But you got to I think most of the people played on it for free, at least the DC Talk guys. But you still had to fly them in and put them up in a hotel and things like that, and Lee Nash and all those folks. And I'm sure we paid like Kenny and Ashley and people like that, and had to pay all the session guys. But it was a real pain, and he was he wanted to do it in the way that we did This Train record. He wanted to do it like, let's just figure it out. Let's have a lot of challenges. I don't want to be in the nicest. Those places make me uncomfortable, the big fancy studios. Let's just do it somewhere kind of real and believable. And that's what we did. But yeah, he was hard to get to know. Then there's a period, once you do get to know him, you're almost sorry you did, because Rich was a brutally honest person. And particularly with his own shortcomings. Like stuff that just there's things some of us that are really close to him know that we'll take to our graves. We'll never share it. Rich had no problem talking about his shortcomings and what he was doing about them. Which, again, it's like I don't think he could have been too forthcoming with that stuff, because he wouldn't have had a career. It's nothing that all of us haven't been through, but you know what I'm saying. You're just supposed to say it.
Yeah, especially in that industry at that time.
Correct.
Probably even more so than now, in some ways. You started with the Liturgy tour, right?
Yes, sir. Okay.
Now, I always wondered why you didn't play on the Brothers Keeper album. Were you not officially a Ragamuffin at that point?
Yeah, man, that's a tough one. This Train were touring, and I was doing a bunch of stuff, and Rich was asking me about doing this record, and I said, I don't know, I think so, maybe I got stuff going on, tell me about it later or something. I can't remember what it was, but Rich took me to mean I couldn't do it or didn't want to do it. So Jimmy Abeg's a great bass player. He started out as a bass player. So Rich's like, Jimmy, why don't you just play bass? And Jimmy's like, yeah, sure, I don't care. So Jimmy's going to play bass. Meanwhile, I think I was working on the Mimes record. And because that record was actually finished way before it got released. It was just sat in the can for a long time. But yeah, and then Rick kept calling me during the making of the record. He's like, dude, Rich really wants you to come down. I was like, well, he never asked me. And it's kind of this weird standoff, where Rick just went, come down, hang out, and you'll be on the record. I'm like, yeah, I don't want to do it that way. I was like, I don't want to weasel my way in. That's how I felt. And it turns out it was a complete misunderstanding. Rich thought I didn't want to do it, and I thought he didn't want me there.
Oh, no kidding.
So we joked about it later, and it was like, oh, yeah, sorry about that. But I was working on a few records at the time up in Chicago, and I was touring quite a bit, and I would have really had to make it work. But I very much wanted to do that record. I guess I wasn't clear. And then Rich wasn't clear, and blah, blah, blah. Next thing you know, I just didn't feel like going down there. And it sounded like it was a real mess of a record to make. Rich is used to having these really heavy-handed producers like Reed Arvin, very heavy-handed producers. And then this way he's like, let's all just make a record. Because in a way, he figured that's how This Train did it, stuff like that. He was like, those guys just hang out, and then the next thing you know, there's a record. They're like, well, it's not really that simple. We were very cooperative about it. Somebody kind of has to steer the ship, which is why, Rick Elias kind of took over. And that was necessary. Someone had to steer the ship, when it came to production and structure of things.
I think the whole band was credited as producer, but did Rick really, he was really the one at the helm on that record?
At the end, Rick started taking more liberties, because really Rick was the only one qualified to do it. Everyone else is like, being a great musician doesn't make you a record producer. You know what I mean? All of a sudden now the engineer's got a million opinions. Well, that's cool, but that's not really his function there. His function is to make everything sound good, not to give you an aesthetic. So it just started, I think it got so out of control at the last minute, Rick tried to kind of steer the ship. And then he produced, of course, after Rich passed, he produced the next couple records. and we absolutely needed him to do that. So anyway.
The album comes out. Now, you were on the tour. The tour kicks off in September 95. You would pretty much go on to spend much of the next 2 years on the road with Rich. And you're a guy who has, you've logged countless miles on the road with different bands over the years. And you've toured with Robert Plant.
Yeah.
I've heard stories about, life on the road with Rich being somewhat, different than other artists, and in some ways more difficult. How did it compare for you?
Well, the first time I met Rich, the one thing he does different than any other artist is he doesn't travel with the band, or he didn't. Like when I first met him, me and Rick opened for him at some place in Texas, and this is before either of us played with him. And there was a big tour bus, like there is on tours that size, and all the band come out of it, and Rich pulls up in his car, in his Jeep, and that continued on. Then when the Ragamuffin Band got fully established, we got the bus, and Rich still drove his Jeep. Then Rick decided he hated tour buses, because there's kind of neat things about tour buses. You can sleep, whenever you want. It's got some convenience to it. But you're kind of stuck with each other the whole time. And Rick wasn't a fan. He tried to just take the back lounge, and turn it into his little office or whatever. Like, well, that doesn't work, dude. We all need a place to go. He's like, yeah, I want to go back to vans instead of a full bus. So the 95 tour was literally, I think it was like 5 vans. And then Rich still drove himself. Even though it made way more sense to get on a bus. But on the 95 tour, you had Ashley Cleveland. She had a nanny, and her kid Henry was very little at the time. Carolyn Aarons is on the tour, and she wound up driving herself. It was such an eccentric group of people. So you had the Rags in one van, just me, Aaron, Jimmy, and Rick. And that's it. If we had extra musicians, they were in a different van. Rick was pretty adamant, just the core Rags in this van. Because I can get along with you guys. I don't want to listen to the crew or whoever. So then the crew had a van, and then, even that was, I think they had 2 vans because there was different, versions of the crew, different jobs needed to be done. It was just crazy. Gay Quisenberry, the manager, she also did all our merch. She had her own van because she didn't want to travel with anybody. Carolyn had her own van. I think Ashley had her own van with her nanny, and sometimes her husband Kenny would come out. Henry was on the whole tour. And her little one, he was probably 3 or 4 at the time. Anyway, that was weird. This is a huge caravan, because you know how much can go wrong if there's 6, 7 vehicles? A lot can go wrong. One flat tire could compromise a gig. We had the equipment truck and all that stuff. It's like, it was a stupid way to tour. We should have one semi and one bus. But we never did that with Rich. Rich never did anything the easy way. The very last tour, the one I told you was just the young single guys. It wasn't the Rags. I was the only member of the Rags that did the last tour. And he bought this train a truck, or Gay did. It was a terrible little thing. It was like a Toyota with this huge box on it. And our record company converted kind of half of the box into a little sleeping area, like a fake tour bus. And it was loaded with all the gear, and we could barely fit it for that tour. And me and Jordan drove this little Toyota truck all over the country. And then the rest of the band were in a van, 2 vans, and Rich drove himself. It was just a ridiculous way to tour. But for whatever reason, Rich had no interest in doing it that way. So he was odd in that regard. And he was a little weird to the young guys because he thought they needed to learn how the business works. He didn't want to make it too easy on them. If that makes sense? So we had to set up all our own gear. We had it down to almost military fashion because there was so much gear. You unload the truck together, and you better not be late. If any of the kids were late in any of the various vans, the excuse just didn't matter. Rich was furious. He was very hard on everybody because he just went, these guys are never going to learn that this is a job if I don't kind of lean on them a little bit. So he was taking on this kind of tough dad kind of persona with these guys, just trying to get them to understand that the music business isn't just showing up and goofing off and strumming a guitar. So he had a million ways he went about it, but none of them were ever organized or made any sense. You know, nowadays, if I get on a decent tour, you go on a Tim McGraw tour, you don't drive yourself. You're not even allowed to. You can't fly in. You can't fly home and then fly in on the day of the show, because what if the flight's delayed? They take no chances on a proper tour. You know, you can only fly in on days off. You have to fly in the day before the next show. You know, things like that. You got to ride on the bus. You can't drive yourself. You know, things like that. So Rich was pretty hippie, free-for-all when it came to that stuff. And somehow, I don't remember ever missing a gig, no matter what happened. So that's where he was different.
There's this lost album of Rich Mullins. And I say it's lost because it's never really been released in a big way. It wasn't with a record label. And we're talking about the Canticle of the Plains. You're the guy. You and Jordan were the guys doing this. What was that experience like, recording that album? And what did Mullins talk to you? Like, I'm a little curious why it wasn't released with a record label. I mean, sure, it's featuring some of the biggest names in Christian music, and here it is, just kind of, released in an independent way. As a fan, I was right on top of it. I ordered that thing as soon as I knew about it, but it wasn't a big release. So what can you tell us about the background of that?
Well, I think I said part of it earlier, but I'll say it kind of again. But somehow Rich became a huge fan of the first This Train record, and he asked me how I did it. He said, "I like the way you produce. You see, you're open to these fun ideas, and you let things happen." And he saw it as copacetic with the way he likes to work, doing a lot of things on the fly. Letting experiences happen rather than planning everything out. So we did it in a basement on borrowed gear. He's like, "Okay, I want you to produce this record that I'm doing." And I already knew about Canticle because he'd been writing it. And I knew about his whole St. Frank thing and all that. He said, "I want to do a whole record on that. And it's going to have a lot of guests, blah, blah, blah." He goes, "I want to do it in your basement on whatever gear you have. I want to do it just like the This Train record." I'm like, "Well, we don't have the basement anymore. We have a small studio," which wasn't a proper studio. It was just office rooms. He's like, "Great, we'll do it there." And I said, "Okay, but if we're going to record Michael Tate's voice, I need to rent preamps. I need to do this or that." He's like, "What's that going to cost?" And I said, "Well, X." And he's like, "Just buy one and I'll pay for it. It's cheaper than renting." And so he bought a lot of studio gear for us in the process. It was actually the biggest budget record I've ever done, besides the Jesus record. And for no reason, because it was done in such a homespun way, but he just made it as hard as possible. Like, he just decided one day that somebody had to play whatever on it. Then we have to fly that guy in. That costs money. And so we had all these weird kind of spur-of-the-moment expenses. And that record wound up costing like $125,000 or more.
Really?
Yeah. Even though I think Tate and Kevin, I think they sang for free, but we still had to, or maybe they didn't. I really couldn't tell you. I can't remember how that budget was allocated, because Rich and I had the same manager, and she just doled out the dough. You know what I mean? And saved a certain amount for me and Jordan's fee for the studio and our time. But yeah, it was a dopey way to make a record in a lot of ways, but it was super fun. And he wanted to use a lot of those Kid Brothers guys as much as he could. And in some cases we could, in some cases it was a real drag, and I'd have to kind of like talk him into bringing in a different drummer for a couple takes or a couple songs, or we fly in Kenny Greenberg to do some more guitar or whatever. But he just had this idea, but he wanted it to be very genuine. He didn't want a big, slick studio record. He thought maybe we could get more authenticity for that kind of earthiness of Frank's character if we just did it in more like a This Train kind of fashion. And I couldn't tell you if that's what happened or not. Honestly, I don't remember. I like the record. I think it's charming. It's not the kind of fidelity that Liturgy Legacy is, because we didn't have access to that kind of gear. Mm-hmm. We were just using what we had. The sort of decent tech of the time for a project studio. But anyway, yeah, so But it was a ball. It was just really convoluted. There was a lot of scheduling to do when you think of, I mean, how many singers are on that dang record? And, I can think of, let's see, at least, and I haven't listened to that record in a long time, but so you got Lee Nash, you got Michael Tate, you got Kevin Max, you got Rich, of course. I think Mitch sings something. Who else? I think there's other people. But there's a million little things. Like Rich would go like, oh, I hear this percussion sound, and he like, where's the nearest music store? And he'd go drive away and come up with some weird thing he saw once on a compassion trip, trying to find. Then he'd have to spend 2 hours trying to learn how to play it, how to make sound come out of it right. And eventually we'd get that, and like, how am I going to get this thing in the mix? It's such a weird little sound. And, so it was a lot of that. So really just getting that record prepped and so it could even make any sense was a lot of editing and a lot of work. And then, and that even spilled over into Mitch's first record that Rich and I co-produced. There's some spillover with the tracking for both of those. So in a way, I would say it was a nightmare, and in a way, I wish I could do it again, But because making records with Rich was really fun for me, especially the one I got to do one with him. That was where I got to steer the ship. I even forget about that record sometimes because basically it doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. But I actually think it's kind of special, and I think it's a special glimpse into who Rich was as an overall artist. I'm trying to think of like the song Lee sings, Buenas Noches from Nagadoches or whatever. Yeah. That is gloriously pretty. Mm-hmm. It paints a really vivid picture of the Southwest, You just see yourself there. Music can do that. Like I can listen to that song from Tennessee and all of a sudden the air starts drying out and the stars are a little bigger, I can totally see it. So I think Rich succeeded in that sense. Why it never got released to a bigger market, I really don't know. I think because he died before anybody really knew what to do with it. Canonical was just barely starting. We'd just done those couple Cornerstone plays. I don't know if you remember that, mm-hmm. where they did the actual play late at night at Cornerstone. Mm-hmm. And then he had staged it in a couple other spots, and they were planning to stage it in quite a few others. But then he dies, and it's just that was such a heavy thing for so many of us because we lost everything at once. We had a whole mission of that things we wanted to do and that were on the books. Now those aren't going to happen. Rich is never going to write another song. How am I going to pay my bills? It was everything at once. You lost your employer, you lost your mentor, you lost your pastor, you lost everything at once. It was really. So I think maybe that record slipped through the cracks for that reason. That's one theory, at least.
You had a couple songwriting credits with Rich. My Heart Already Knows from the Prayers record. And then, of course, the This Train song, A Million Years, which is a great song. We had Jimmy Abeg on here with us a few months back, and he was talking about the fact that he really always wanted to write with Rich, and it just, for whatever reason, never happened, or that Rich never saw that partnership as part of their relationship. I mean, how did that come about for you to have those couple opportunities to write with him, and what was it like writing with Rich?
I gotta say, to be fair, and this might not be the answer you want, but for one thing, since I was a single guy and all the other Rags had families, I did a lot of the sort of extracurricular things Rich wanted to do that the guys maybe didn't necessarily fit into their lives. I did whatever Rich asked me to do, whether that's producing Canonical, and that took a long time to make. Then he wanted me to produce a record on Mitch. That took a while to make. Then he wanted to do that last tour, the Kid Brothers tour, which was 5.5 months when you include rehearsals. We never saw our homes for 5.5 months. So I had the last year of Rich's life, we were together almost every day. You know what I mean? So that just creates more opportunities than writing in a green room before a gig. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So I just think I have more opportunity than Jimmy did. But I will also say, A Million Years, me and Mitch are listed as co-writers. But here's what really happened. Rich came to me when we were making the Mimes record. I can't remember. We were doing something else during the making of the Mimes record, because we were making that record off and on when we had time, and when we were off tour or whatever. So Rich says, I've got this song idea, and I don't think it's for me. I think it's for you. I'm like, all right, man, let's hear it. He goes, I'm going to need you to co-write. And he plays basically a completed song. And I'm like, what am I co-writing with you? And I swear I wrote 3 lines in that song at the most. And I only remember one for sure. I wrote All the Way Back Whens and Ever Afters. I mean, that's mine. Woohoo. And a couple others, Mitch didn't do anything at all. If you were in the room with Rich, you co-wrote the song. You know what I mean? And he was making up parts as he went. And he goes, yeah, but let's make it a This Train song. I'm like, okay, Jordan, do some of your surfy stuff for the intro. And we just started putting it together in the control room of the studio. And then we just went in and tracked it. So, I mean, it happened that fast. But really, Rich wrote the dang song. I just helped out a tiny bit, and Mitch was there. But maybe he wrote a line and I forgot. But I just don't think so. Then My Heart Already Knows is different. Rich and I started writing that when we were mixing the Canonical record. We went up to Milwaukee to mix it at a different studio with an engineer I really loved. And but so the mixing is, I don't know if you've ever been part of mixing a record, but it takes a couple weeks, and it's a lot of stuff you just don't need to be there for. Do you know what I'm saying? Like a guy's trying to get the right compression on a floor tom or something. That might take him 2 hours, but you don't need to sit there and go. There's nothing you can say about that. You come in, and after he's done what he thinks is right, you're like, okay, now tweak this. So there's time. So anyway, Rich and I wrote We're Getting Nowhere Fast during the mix of Canonical of the Plains, one of the first This Train songs on the Mimes record. And Rich, it just cracked him up. He loved it. He was like, let's write something now, after he heard that tune, because he really liked that song. He thought it was really funny. So he said, what do you got for a title? And I said, man, I was thinking of something like My Heart Already Knows. And I explained what that meant. I had the title laying around. He's like, oh, that's cool. Then he just launches into these great lines. But we never finished it. We got like a verse. And then we had to go back into the mix room, and then things happen, and then he's gone. And I was going through some notebooks of lyrics, and I saw that, and I took it to Rick Elias. I'm like, and I played him what I remembered I might even had a small demo off a tape recorder of Rich singing it or something. I can't remember. But I played it for Rick. He's like, yeah, let's finish that up. And we had to we had the chorus. That Rich wrote the chorus. I wrote the first verse, and then me and Rick wrote the second verse. And we just patched it together because in our minds, because Rich is gone now, we have to make a new record from scratch. Well, if I have some fragments of something that was Rich related, I should share it. So we did. And I think it's a neat song. I mean, that record really, the label hated it, and it was never going to happen. That record didn't. The first record, obviously, the Jesus record, did quite well, but the Prayers record, it bombed for the most part. It sold like 140,000 copies, which, with the budgets we had and with that label, that's a total flop. Which is funny. Now I can sell 20,000. It's like, you got to be kidding me. But because it's a different kind of economic scale, right? When you kind of do things more the way we do them now. Anyway, yeah. So I just thought it needed to be heard. Now it turns out Jimmy's sitting on a bunch of half-finished lyrics of Rich's, where he said, "Well, see if you can do anything with this." And Jimmy just never has yet, but he might. So there's a lot of fragments out there. And I don't know, a couple people have recorded Madeline's song, but I don't know if anybody's done it proper, besides Phil Kagi, maybe. Like on a big release. So I don't know. There's still stuff kind of floating out there. But according to a lot of people, there's a lot of lyrics and a lot of ideas and old tape demos of Rich still floating around, but nobody's kind of seems to know what to do about it. And who knows? I haven't heard of it. It might be for the best.
We've been talking a lot about kind of that last year. And by 1997, it seemed like Rich was kind of moving like a freight train. We've met a couple times over the years. And I remember after a Ragamuffin show one time, you said something to me I never forgot. You said it was like the way Rich was talking at his concerts during that last year. You said it was almost like, even though he obviously didn't, it was like he knew he was going to die. What did you mean by that?
He just talked a lot about death. He talked a lot about going to the other side. And it was very much a theme, you know, of, do you remember that story he told about the sweater? Do you remember that story?
Yeah.
Well, that's about when you get washed up on the other side and Jesus recognizes you because of the sweater. You know, that weird story he told. Well, that's about dying. He actually told me his preferred way of dying on that tour. He said, I don't want to get old and just nod off one day. He's like, I want to be like in a hot air balloon that's on fire over the Grand Canyon. I want it to be big. I want my last few seconds to be exciting. And well, you know, he got that. The way he died was certainly not boring. I don't think anyone would choose that, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
He said given if he had anything to say about it, he'd rather die in a way that's kind of exciting and big and fiery and quick rather than dragging it out and things like that. But he just talked about it a lot. And so when he died, it was like, it was one of the first things I said. I'm like, he knew. And now, I don't know that he knew, but gosh, it sure seemed like it. He even looked terrible the last couple of weeks he was alive. He was only 41 years old, right?
Yeah. Why do you think that is? I was curious about that myself. It really comes through in some of the videos.
He acted like he had the weight of the world on his shoulders at the time. And he had a very big plan coming up. Like, we were about to make the Jesus record. Like, it was supposed to be a week later, we were going to start tracking. After the accident, we were all heading down to, packing our bags and getting ready to head down to Nashville. I was still living in Chicago at the time. I can't remember where we were going to do it and who was engineering. Rick was going to produce. That was already situated. I mean, I was part of that conversation. Like, no more of this group hug production, man. Somebody's got to steer the ship, and I think Rick is the guy to do it. And Rick has a great technical sense. He has a great musical sense. He was the man for the job. But then Rich, he had conditions that we did a mutiny on this, but Rich said, here's what I want to do. He wanted to retire and teach in Window Rock. But he had a lot of actually resistance from people there on that he wasn't a fundamentalist is what his simple answer was. Yet he still continued to buy and stockpile instruments for this music school. You know, we'd be out on the road and he'd find a good deal on some cello or some percussion or this or that, ocarinas or whatever. And he was saving them up for the school. He still was doing his bit. But he kind of went like, he said he came to the realization that wasn't how he could be most effective. He's like, I know I'm able to raise large sums of money. So I'm going to raise large sums of money. And we're gonna think up more and more projects to do. He only wanted so much influence on the reservation. He felt like no way should there be a white pastor. It should all come from the natives. You know what I mean? If we're on the Navajo res, we just want to help the Navajo, equip them to do what they do. He didn't feel like that was his place in the end. He was like, I want to help them. I don't want to be the guy. So his plan was, he goes, I want to do a Ragamuffin Band record that I don't sing on. I'll just play keyboards. You guys all sing your own songs. And then I'm going to go back with Reed Arvin and make a big praise and worship record. And we'll do a tour where we do both records. Then you guys sing a bunch, I'll sing a bunch, and we'll do a whole tour like that. formed a mutiny, and we're like, no way, man. We'll help write the Jesus record, but you're the singer. Nobody wants to hear us sing. He's like, well, we'll see when we get there, but that's what I prefer to do. And it's like, but I think we had talked him into it because he demoed my tune. Surely God is with us. Me and Beaker wrote, and the reason he demoed it is because there's a couple kind of iffy lines in there, and he said, this will never be a single, and if I tell him you wrote it, I don't think it's going to be on the record because that whores line or whatever. I'm like, well, I got that out of the Bible. I don't know. He said, well, if you want it to be successful, you're going to have to change that line. I'm like, fine, you change it because that's what I meant. And then in the end, he went like, you know what? I agree with you. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to pitch it as though I wrote it. It's a brand new record deal. They're going to go for anything I give them, and then I'll tell them afterwards. I'll tell them it's your song after it's already done. He goes, but I'll just kind of fake them out for now. And that's what he did. So he demoed that, and the only one he wouldn't refuse to sing was "Man of No Reputation" because that was his favorite song, and it always was. He made Rick sing that every Ragamuffin Band concert we ever did. And he was always side stage watching. He didn't slip out to have a smoke or something. He stayed there and watched Rick, and he teared up every single time he heard that song. So that was the one song we knew was absolutely had to be on the record. Then after that, we just went that plus whatever Rich demoed, and that's all. So anyway.
I wanted to ask you about Surely God is With Us, because it always interested me that Beaker's only contribution to the Jesus record wasn't a co-write with Rich, but with you. How did that come about?
I asked Beaker. I can't remember. I think he was living in Atlanta at the time, and he was out of the band. But him and Rich were so close. Maybe he wasn't out of the band, but I think he was. And he was kind of wanting to do other things. And I just but he still wanted to write. So I said, well, you want to write a couple tunes? And he had this little office it really is, his writing office is what the rest of the world would use to put their lawnmowers in. It's like in the back of his property, just a little tool shed. But he kind of made a little makeshift writing office back there. And it was a slow, brutal process. Beaker doesn't do anything in a rush. You basically just sit and stare at each other for hours. And he goes, what if a dog comes? So it would be something like, what are you talking about? But a song comes out of it eventually. I had most of that tune written. But I think I'm good at the title, because I think if you got a great title, the song will write itself. And sometimes it actually does. But I didn't have a second verse, I think, or something. And so we wrote the second verse together. And then this comes back to Rich's weird death obsession. I had a song called The Longest Goodbye that was on the Mimes of the Old West record. It's the last song. And it was kind of about, I wanted this sort of, almost like the Great Divorce, this spacey, somehow you pass to the other side, but it's not very clear cut. But it was kind of about, passing out of this life. So I had the title and the chorus, and Beaker helped me patch together the rest of it. Which is really, by the way, is the hardest part. Once you got a title and a chorus, you're home free. But the other stuff is really hard. That's where the hard work comes in. Anybody can get inspired for a cool idea. But the nuts and bolts of finishing a song, that's actual work. It's less about inspiration at that point. It's more about hard work. Keeping it in context, making sure rhythmically it works and all those things. Does it say what you're wanting to say? Does it expand on the idea? And Beaker was really good about that stuff.
Take us into the studio with you for those last few weeks when you started working on Mitch's first album. I know you were with Rich pretty much every day for the last few weeks he was here.
Yeah.
Anything stand out from that time, just in the studio with him?
Yeah, kind of. There was still a lot of the Kid Brothers around from the tour, and a lot of them played on the record. But we flew in a couple ringers, Kenny Greenberg and stuff like that. And the record wasn't quite done. I had a few things to do. Rich's piano parts were on a MIDI kind of file, and I was going to use a different MIDI source later, but he just played on a kind of a cruddy sounding electronic piano. But I was going to transfer the MIDI later. That was a nightmare, and I did it way after he died. It was heartbreaking because I'm looking at these little MIDI notes. That's Rich's fingers. You know what I'm saying? That was just, I barely made it through it. But the getting that, we were supposed to finish on this one day. We weren't quite finished, but the rest was kind of up to me. It was just leg production crap. But Mitch got sick that day. So there was one song he couldn't finish, and we labored over it all day, and he didn't finish it. And I had to kind of trick him into finishing it like a year later, or 6 months later, or whatever it was. But anyway, when we were making it, it was all the Kid Brothers, and my landlord was at the offices I was at. There was a couple small churches there, and the churches were complaining about the Kid Brothers because they would just do things like, because these spaces were all kind of interconnected. You know, there's like these small office buildings, but there was a Black Holiness church downstairs. There's this Puerto Rican church upstairs. Meanwhile, you got the Kid Brothers like streaking through the hallways and throwing food at each other, and you know, just being kids. And the funniest thing about that, so the last day of recording, we take a quick break for some coffee, and me and Rich go for a walk. It was a gloriously nice day. So we're taking a walk, and he said, I got to tell you, I'm glad I did this thing with the Kid Brothers, because, but I am so sick of being with young guys right now. Because it's all about pantsing each other and, you know, throwing food. And it's just because I cannot wait to get back on the road with the Rags, where it's adults who can actually play, and I don't have to show them every little thing. And I just want to have the band again and grown men. Yeah, man, I can see that. It's kind of wearing me out too. But, so he says this. Then after he says this, he becomes more childish than I'd ever seen him act in his life. So I don't get that part to this day. But so he does a thing. Our overdub room is really just like a storage closet. So it's, you know, you close the door so you have some separation. Rich is going in to do a backup vocal on Mitch's record. And he said, the door is closed. He's just talking through the mic. He goes, do you guys get a picture of me cutting this vocal? Maybe it'd be cool for the album. I'm like, yeah, man. So we opened the door and got a camera ready. Rich is buck naked, head to toe. And so Mike, the drummer, Mike Ockefer, he takes the picture. And the only thing Rich said was like, he said, okay, close the door. Close the door. And then he says over the mic, he goes, is my butt still tan? Because he had been hiking out in Window Rock naked, apparently. And he wanted to know if his rear end was still tan. And it was. But then, and this is moments after him criticizing how immature everybody has been. Then he goes out, he comes out of the overdub room, still with not a stitch on. And he said, you know, I was thinking, Jordan, who was engineering, the guitar player from this train, he's not a touchy-feely person. He's just like, if you went to hug him or something, you could feel him tense up. He was just not good with that. So Rich decides the best thing for Jordan to get over that is to be hugged by a naked man. And he just attacks Jordan and forces him to hug him. And Jordan's just wanting to blow his brains out. And it's extremely funny. Then Rich winds up going streaking up and down the hall. So after saying he was so sick of all these kids, I think he was getting his last day in with them. You know what I'm saying? And he just did the most childish, goofy stuff. And we had a blast. So that was our last day recording. And he died that night.
That was his last day on Earth.
That was his last day on Earth.
You want me to ask? I have no question. What possible response do I have to that? Oh, here's what I'll ask you. So it's often said of Mullins, you know, he's more saint-like than you or I, and he's also more of a sinner than you or I. What do you make of that? Is that an exaggeration? Is that true to life? Like, you know,
that's absolutely true.
Yeah.
I don't think I could add to that if I wanted to. I heard somebody once say, he's just like everybody else, only more.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a good one, I think. I used to just say he was an interesting bunch of guys. But that's all true. His spiritual side seemed way deeper, and his crass human side was way more honest than most Christians would be.
How did you hear the news that Rich had been killed?
I had, this is pretty much pre-cell phone for most people this time in 97. And, let's see. I was kind of getting mad. We were supposed to only do a half day in the studio. Mitch was going to finish one vocal and we were done. But it just never worked that way with the Kid Brothers guys. And I had scheduled to leave town at about 3 in the afternoon. And I had been dating a girl who lived in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So we were going to meet somewhere in like Ohio just to hang out for the weekend and go do some stuff. And I had booked a hotel for myself and all that, and to meet up so that we could have some kind of the long distance thing was hard. And I'm kind of like trying to figure out how to tell Rich without being a jerk. I'm like, I kind of got a date this weekend, I want to see the girl I'm seeing, all that stuff. And he's like, yeah, we just got to finish this. And the next thing, we don't wrap up till 9 at night. And we were supposed to wrap up at noon. And so I was actually kind of irritated by that point. But it was such fun work, and that I was kind of into it, if you know what I'm saying. So I'm happy about this. I go like, okay, dude, I've got to split now. I'll be back on Monday. I'll get all this stuff buttoned up next week, and then the week after we're doing the start of the Jesus record. So I gave him a hug. I told him I loved him, which I'm glad I got to do. And he's like, and he just said, all right, well, you be good this weekend. And he kind of gave me a look like, like he was doubtful of my ability to be good. And then, but that's what it was kind of, he even said, but he used to say it to a lot of people, but he's like, but if you can't do that, just be God's. And like, you got it, man. See you later. And I just hauled the mail out of there. It was a horrible rainstorm, really thick. And I was actually terrified on this whole trip because I had to drive like 6-7 hours for my weekend. And I can't explain this one. I don't know if it's like got a spiritual quality to it or not. But I got to where I was going, called the girl. She's got there too. And I said, before we were going to hang out, though it was late at night, we're going to hang out at least a little while and then get up the next day and go do some stuff. But I think, man, I got a lot coming up. I better check my voicemail real quick first, if you don't mind. So I call my voicemail at home, and I'm not exaggerating. It's one of those things where, a day goes by, how many voicemails you get? 2, 4, whatever it is. I think the little robot said you have 50 some odd messages. I can't remember. It was just a crazy amount of messages. And all the messages went like this, the first 10 or 12. It went like, hey, man, just wanted to tell you I'm really sorry. Call me if you need anything. And that's all they would say. Click. And it's like, man, I just heard the news. I don't even know what to say. People are just saying stuff like that. They're clearly something huge happened. You could hear it in their voices, people crying, trembling. But no one said what happened. For quite a few of them, it got like 15 deep, and I still don't know what they're all sad about. So another friend finally, after a few deep, goes, hey man, you got to call me as soon as possible, no matter what time. And I called this friend, and she said, she told me what had happened. So I called the girl I was seeing. I said, hey, I don't know how to say this, but I got to leave. I got to go back. I'll tell you about it. And I just got back in my car and drove home. And barely drive, It's like I didn't even know. You know how when something like that first happens, you don't even know how to. It's that shock. It's like, wait, what? No. Then you're looking for how it's not true. You're looking for any kind of, like, no, that didn't happen. Somebody looked like him, or it was surely they haven't confirmed this yet. And I stopped and I listened to the rest of my voicemail somewhere when I stopped to get gas, and it was definitely true. And it was all manner of things. In some cases, it would be really sweet people that are dear to you, and they'll say nice things. And then in some cases, it was fans going, "Hey, man, I just heard. Is there any way you can get me on the list to get into the funeral? Because I heard it's for family only and friends, or you have to be invited. Like, can you get me on? Is there some sort of list you can get me on?" I had a bunch of those in a row, and it was all manner of things. You know, it's like people are just. They're not bad people. They just are that clueless, you know. And what? I'm still wrapping my head around the idea that there is a funeral, much less, you know. But that's the next thing we know. That's my next couple of days. You know, I got to go down to Indiana and speak at his funeral, and I got to go. Somehow, somebody in Wichita wanted us to do something, a big memorial service, and they wanted us to speak and be there. But it was like the next day. I'm like, we're in Indiana, you know, how we get to Wichita tomorrow? And Michael W. Smith, at the time, he was touring a lot still, and he had a private jet. And so Smitty called us up and was like, "Hey, man, I heard you guys are wanted in Wichita. Let's go." They asked me to, so I'm going to go anyway. Well, let's just take my plane. And he throws us on a plane, you know, which I've never, you know, I've been on 2 private planes in my life. It's if you've never done it, I highly recommend it. But you get it takes like 2 hours to get to Wichita from, you know what I mean? It's like, it was crazy. Anyway, it's just this whirlwind of memorials and what the heck just happened, and none of us could wrap our heads around it. And we're supposed to get started. The label still, and his family asked us to keep going with the record as planned. We wound up asking if we could have a break because we just couldn't even do it. You know, we're trying to get together in a room and hash out the songs, and nobody could keep it together. You know what I mean? It's like you have to have at some point, you got to stop crying and learn the chords. And who's going to sing this song? And you got to make all those kind of grown-up decisions about it, and none of us were in a position to pull that off. You know, we couldn't stop blubbering and go. You know, it's like such a dream state for a couple of months where you just couldn't even figure it out. You know how you're supposed to even feel about this, and now we're making his record. You know, which is why we kind of insisted on leaving his demos as a part of the record.
Mm-hmm.
Then we have to guess what he wanted the record to even be. You know what I mean? It's like Rick had talked to Rich a lot. They had a lot of meetings about, well, they were going to use some strings and go really big on a couple tunes and this and that. And boy, they sure did. Rick pulled out the stops on that. Mm-hmm. But anyway, that's kind of how it all wrapped up.
Talking about the Jesus record for a moment, I mean, I'm assuming that when it first happened, I can't imagine that you guys were thinking that it would continue, but then here you are, you're being asked to do this. There are a lot of guests who are on that album. I mean, were people like just lining up to knock on the door to wanting to be a part of that record, or were those guests particularly selected for that album?
Everyone who's on it asked to be on it, but I mean, everybody asked to be on it. I mean, I don't know how many people wanted to be on that record when they found out we were going to do it. Like, the phone wouldn't stop ringing. But it'd be like, okay, I was about to name names and be a jerk, but I'm not. But it was people like, what the heck do you have to do with any of this? You know, be some big pop artist like Rich hated you, or hated your music, What, you just want to be on this for the publicity, But there were certain people, Michael W. Smith, him and Rich were friends. And he really helped us to travel to a couple different locations and get to these memorials because he felt like that was good for people. And, taking a charter jet somewhere is super expensive. All that stuff. He was cool, and he was part of Rich's life. And honestly, artistically, we didn't want Smitty because I didn't. They're very different kinds of singers. So I was originally going to sing whatever tune he did. I think I was originally going to do it. Then we're like, no, we got to have Smitty. It's the right thing to do. We'll just figure out how to make it work. Find a song that works for his voice. And Amy was a no-brainer because Rich and Amy were very close, and it was very important to Amy to do her part, and she killed it.
That song sounds like it was written for her.
It really does. It really does. And hats off to Rick, because he was the one who kind of, in some cases, somebody come in. I can't remember in Amy's case if she went, I gotta sing that one. That's mine. But in most cases, Rick went, no, this is for, whoever. And I think I was also, we were just tag teaming it, when we were tracking it. And then I was singing All the Way to Kingdom Come. We traded off the verses. Then there's that big chorus. A little high for me. It wasn't the right timbre for Rich. Jimmy couldn't do it. Jimmy's voice, you kind of got to take it for what it is. But, you know what I mean? He has a very character kind of voice. But it's a big old Beatle-y kind of melody, no way. And that's one of us, like, Keggy, man. Keggy's got to do it. They were friends. And Keggy had played on the last This Train record. We're all pals. So, yeah, he's got to do it. And he wanted to do it. So yeah, let's get Keggy. And I do remember being in an overdub room trying to get a headphone mix to sing backup vocals on one of the songs. And I'm like, hey, man, could you turn Smitty down slightly and turn Amy up a little bit on my mix? And Jordan was engineering. I'm like, did you hear what I just said? Like, I'm singing with Michael Smith and Amy Grant on a record. It just cracked me up to no end. And something I never thought I'd do. It wasn't exactly on my bucket list either, but it was, I never thought I'd do it, but we're intermingling with all these characters, who just, it was so important to them.
The sound of the Jesus record is night and day. You have these lo-fi, vulnerable tracks with Mullins, and then you have the studio album. And I think if I'm going to look at Mullins' work, the Jesus record might be the most polished studio album, even in some senses more than the Liturgy album. I guess I'm curious, was the record company looking for that? They knew that you had the big names. Were they, or did Elias just kind of, it's just what he did. He made it that polished.
Like I say, Rick, I don't envy Rick for that task, because he's in full tilt mourning and grief-stricken, but he has to put on his big boy pants, and be a record producer. He has to interpret for Rich now, because Rich isn't there. All he had to base it on was the talks. Like, Rick and Rich had met with Tom Howard, who did all our string arrangements. And so we knew Tom was going to be involved. So we stuck to that plan. We knew what songs Rich liked that he wanted, that he had a kind of an aesthetic with. That for some of the things like My Delivery, he wanted a big liturgy kind of sound. He wanted, blah, blah, blah. So we had a few pieces of the puzzle. But I mean, gosh, Rick pulled out all the stops. I mean, the strings on My Deliver, there's 2 full choirs on My Deliver. And cut in different sessions. And the strings, we flew to London and used half of the London Philharmonic at Abbey Road, where the Beatles made all their records. And we used, an Abbey Road engineer, and it was crazy. I was just, that's pretty epic. But I think it sounds like it, I would have never done it, that way. I would have gone way more earthy. That would have been my instinct. But Rick was trying to take Rich's body of work into consideration. And I think Rick made the right calls. I've had artist friends go like, he went way too slick on that, man. Rich would have never done that. I'm like, well, Rich tried many times. He just wasn't very good at it. Rich wasn't good at keeping things super tight and slick. Rick is a total craftsman. But if you listen to Rick's solo records, they're nothing like that record. He was trying to interpret the best thing to do. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So I don't know. Like I said, I don't envy him. Then we were trying to figure out who was going to sing the vocal on That Where I Am, There You May Also Be. And I sang it live. And Rick and I think we tag teamed that vocal, didn't we, me and Rick? But we had Aaron play along to the original demo so that Rich could be in the song. And it was one of the only ones we could do it on, because the demos were literally, I'll never understand this one, because Rich didn't demo records. He didn't like to demo records because he didn't want to give the label too much input. He just wanted to hand them a finished product. So he went, while we were making Mitch's record, I mean, Rich went to like wherever, the nearest by store, and he bought a boombox cassette deck that you just hit. And he couldn't figure out how to work that. You know, it's like he wasn't a technical dude. He broke the first couple tapes. I don't even know how he did it. But we finally got him set up, had one of the Kid brothers run the tape for him. And he just played either piano or guitar in this big empty sanctuary. And but the quality of a battery-operated boombox, the tape's not going to roll consistently. It's going to warble. You know what I'm saying? As raw as those demos sound, we actually paid an engineer a lot of money to make them sound that good. You know what I'm saying? So there was no way we could include him on everything. The tapes were just too dodgy. But on that Where I Am, that we did.
Did you put a lot more work into making that song work with Rich? I guess I mean as far as cleaning up the tape.
Yeah, we tried. We didn't add anything. We just tried to EQ as much hiss out as we could and tape warble and straighten out some of that stuff, just so it'd be a little more presentable. But yeah, I mean, an engineer spent a whole day trying to kind of make that stuff a little more presentable, because it really became important to us, and we insisted to the label, if we do it, it has to be a double record. It had to include, which double records don't happen in Christian music. It had to include the demos, period. And a lot of people only listen to the demos. I get that.
Yeah, Joe and I go back and forth. I'm more of a demos guy, but
an album guy.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think part of that, though, is if I can give you any insight into that, is Chris was you were a Rich fan, Chris. While you saw him in concert, you met him a couple times. I really didn't know who Rich was until about a year after he died, and so the Jesus record was really my introduction to Rich. So the album itself actually means a lot to me.
That makes sense. If you knew him more, maybe you'd get a little more attached to the demos at the time. I think they're both. I'm glad we did both.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because I think if we just released the demos, that would have been kind of a sad place to leave thing, because it's so raw. It would have been great for a couple people to help him through the grieving process, but as a real document to his last body of work, I think the record had to be made.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Just my take on it.
So you make the record, you release it, then you got to go back out on the road.
Yeah, that was brutal.
Yeah, we had David Mullins was on with us a few weeks ago, and he kind of referred to those weeks after Rich died as being the funeral tour, but you literally did it. I mean, it was a memorial service on the road. What kind of toll does that take on a band?
I think it was hardest on Rick, because a lot of people wanted him to be Rich now, and Rick is Rick, but he really wanted to honor Rich. I mean, the reason there isn't a lot of output from Rick musically, he's only done one record since then, is because he's just never quite got over it. He doesn't know how to deal with it. He had a real strong affinity with Rich, and as a partner aesthetically, he's still eaten up by what kind of music would we have by now if we could have kept going in that line, because that's what Rich wanted to do for the next 5 years minimum, was a stronger integration of all that. Rick as the producer, and really start getting in some adventurous stuff, but with Rick at the helm to steer it. So Rick, he had so much weight on his shoulders, and it was weird. I mean, the memorial kind of aspect of it was all over the map, because you try and just introduce the next song and you start losing it, because you think of something, that he would have done during that song in the set or whatever, and you're like, okay, you just can't. You got to keep it together enough to even address the audience. And most of my sort of stage banter has always been somewhat comedy kind of based with this train and all that stuff. So that's what I know how to do. And I thought that would be valuable, but it's harder than you think when you're trying to keep from crying. It's a little harder to come up with funny stuff on the fly. But you need to give that relief to the audience. You need to give them when we look back at someone's life, it shouldn't be all sadness. Particularly Rich's life, it was hysterical. You know, it was profound. It was all we wanted to try and encapsulate all of those things, and then we had to play our favorite songs, but we had to play their favorite songs to an extent. But we definitely erred to the side of our favorite songs. And when we first did the tour, we brought out a lot of extra musicians because we didn't know how to pull it off. Like, well, Michael Ockefer learned how to play hammered dulcimer really well from being in Kid Brothers, so we took him on tour as the dulcimer player for Creed and for, you know, the songs that needed it, Calling Out Your Name. And we always started with the recording of Rich playing hammered dulcimer. He did Nothing But the Blood of Jesus, that little snippet on hammered dulcimer. We started the concert that way, and then the band would come on stage to that and start into my deliver. We had keyboard players and maybe a background singer or two. And then as time went on, really the keyboard player was kind of not a nice guy, and he got offered some gigs. He wanted to get a sub for a couple of gigs, and we just told him to take a hike, and we just like, let's just tough it out, man. We went with no notice at all. We had a gig in Dallas as a 6-piece, and a gig the next day in Houston, let's say, I can't remember, as a 4-piece. And we have to figure it out on the van ride. And we did. And also we're like, you know, I think I like this better. This is more believable to what Rich would do in the situation, you know. And okay, now we don't have hammered dulcimer, and that's a drag. But we're gonna have to figure out how to do it. You know, we're gonna figure out how to not have piano, because we just decided, you know, we didn't want piano or hammered dulcimer because of the guy that plays that isn't here anymore. You know what I mean? So instead of having some other guy play Rich's parts, we'd be like, let's do it without Rich's parts. In that sense, we thought that was a more honest thing to do, and it actually was, and it worked.
I remember seeing you guys on the Prayers of a Ragamuffin tour, and during Creed, Jimmy essentially emulating the hammered dulcimer part on the guitar. It was killer.
Yeah, no, Jimmy came to the party on that song in particular. Yeah, he figured out some tap delay thing, which Jimmy's always been really good at, those weird delay tricks and stuff. And yeah, he covered a lot of the dulcimer stuff. He covered a lot of the mandolin stuff. He covered a lot of the little ancillary things that Rich would do. And of course, Rick is an incredible acoustic and electric player. So amongst us, we just figured it out.
When did you get approached about doing that record? I mean, a follow-up to the Jesus record. Was there any sense in the beginning that you would continue beyond the Jesus record as a band?
That, from the time Rich died to the time we stopped playing, it was pretty day to day. In a sense, we knew we were going to commit to the Jesus record for a year. We knew that. We knew we had to, because there's a lot of. We had to go to England, you know, we had to go to Ireland, we had to go to Central Europe, we had to do all of the States. And that, you know, that takes time. So we knew we were in it for a year and a half. And then the label just kind of went like, all right, what's next, you know? And the Prayers of a Ragamuffin thing, that was Jimmy's idea, I believe, I want to say. Because, or maybe it was Rich's, where they said, well, okay, after the Jesus record, because Rich said every song has to be about Jesus on that record. The next record, he said, let's all put our own prayers into it. It's either the songs are prayers or they're about prayer. And it might have been Rich, I guess, and or Jimmy. And then we were like, well, he did have one other idea that for sure, so let's keep going, I guess, and try. And that was a terribly hard record to make. Because now you don't know what to consider, because Rich is gone. It's not like the Jesus record where you go, I know he wanted strings here or there. And so how much do you continue that? How much do you not? Really, at our core, we sounded more kind of like the Heartbreakers or something, you know, as a band. So like, let's do more stuff like that. And Surely God Is With Us, that's very Tom Petty in its own way. And I used to write that way because I like the way Rick and Jimmy play to those kinds of feels. And Aaron's a no-brainer. You can play anything you want. So we had seriously good musicians in that band. I mean, really good players, but guys who could improvise and play with a lot of heart. But at our core, I thought we were good at that kind of heartland kind of Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers sound. And had I had more to say in the record, it would have been more that way. But Rick was still questioning other what about the whole legacy of this thing? And it was not an easy thing. And it's a very spotty record. I think it would be fair to say that, Rick was in a lot of turmoil during the making of that record. He just didn't know what to do, and he didn't know how to be, and he didn't know how to be what people needed him to be, and, it was very, very difficult. And then it's like a couple label people, bless their hearts, are awesome people. They want us to fly to England for a photo shoot, and we're like, that's a lot of money to take pictures. But we did. We flew there for like a week, and I guess so. It just felt so wrong and weird. And then the label are pitching song ideas, like the A&R guy. Like, what? Wait, what? And I actually let them. I mean, I had an unfinished song that I pitched for that record. What's the one? Not Bouncing Off the Ceiling. The other one, Nothing You Don't Know.
Yeah.
It was actually going to be on the Mimes record. But Rick always said, he's like, you never finished the song. It doesn't even have a chorus. Like, yeah, but I kind of like it. He's, well, put it on this album, but we're writing a chorus. He's like, let me help you finish it. So we come up with the chords, and that's it. Rick doesn't want to write lyrics for it. He goes, those are your lyrics, you write. Then on the chorus, two of the label guys go like, hey man, we got this great idea for a chorus. And I let them do it. One of the worst decisions I ever made. That chorus is stupid. The lyrics are idiotic. And I would never have written that. So I go back to the original version, unfortunately, and that's the better song. It was better left as a slightly unfinished song. Things like that happen a lot where we just went, yeah, sure, man, whatever. Aaron wrote one song, and we didn't quite finish it, but we recorded it anyway. And, there's a lot of sort of unfinished stuff on that record. We were just not in the position to do it. And then that label folded after that anyway. It was Myrrh Records, And so between this train and Ragamuffin Band, I helped in 2 labels. I don't feel that bad about it.
Just did your part, right?
You cross over into the business side and things get pretty creepy pretty fast.
Mm-hmm. I remember clear as day. Concert I attended was in it was a Mennonite high school in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. It was the fall of 2000, and you were in rare form that night. I guess you started talking about how you were, I think, on the verge of being dropped by the label, and that I think you said, and I quote, "Our record company thinks that you, the audience, are stupid." What was going on behind the scenes there?
Well, I think I was telling the truth, but sometimes maybe you can choose to just shut up, and I didn't. But the labels do think the audience is stupid in country music and in Christian music, and I find that really offensive. I don't know who they are. They're people who paid money to see the show, and you should give them your best work. But the label starts thinking they know what audiences want, as though an audience in Lancaster and an audience in Boston are the same thing, or Phoenix or wherever, or Holland. And I just found that so offensive that they think they understand people in this generic group mentality way. And Rich's fans were all over the map. Some were like deep thinkers. Some were just people who liked Awesome God. It was folks. And I find it really offensive when you try and figure out what people like. And it shows in my personal body of work. Like I just do what I like and hope somebody else cares. Because at the end of the day, that's the only honest thing you can do. The only record where I tried to kind of cop to that is my worst record. So, you know what I'm saying? You can't do it. And to an extent, that Rags record suffered from that. And I don't think that was our fault. We had all this pressure. I remember even back then, labels, if they're putting down $100,000 to make a record, they want some input. I'd rather make a record for $20,000 and give you the final product, and just I'll see you when it's done, but don't talk to me until then. We kind of forget we're talking about your time as a Ragamuffin in those few years after Rich passed away, but
during much of this train is still going on. I guess just as we wrap up, just what were those final days like, those final few years as a Ragamuffin? And then, did that take a toll on this train for you personally? Well, just take us back to that period for you.
Well, to an extent, it ended this train. The Rags didn't think it was right for me to be a frontman in two bands. They felt like I was splitting up my creativity and my whatever, They didn't like that I was doing two bands. This train didn't like how much they were having to sit home. Jordan was going on the road with us, but he was like front of house engineer. And it's like, what are we doing? What's going on with the band? Joe's just sitting home, you know what I mean? So that sucked. And then I still feel like this train I felt like they were two different things. And I felt like I could make them two different things. But I understood the pressure too. Because you got the label pressure too. They're dumping money into this thing. So in a way, it really kind of ended this train. But, Jordan was on the verge of, he got into a pretty serious relationship to a woman he's still married to and has a child with. And so Jordan kind of wanted to give it up anyway. And so we just laid it down. And meanwhile, the Ragamuffin thing, the pressure had gotten to Rick so bad. There were certain things Rick and I felt strongly we wanted to still do. Part of that was World Youth Day with the Catholic Church. Because we thought Rich would be down with that. And we were, except it didn't pay any money at all. The label covered our expenses. And some guys are like, I'm not touring for 2 months for free. You know what I mean? I think that was kind of a thing. And I'm like, okay, I get that, but we're going to. Because we think it's the right thing to do. Because, the Jesus Record tour, it was difficult and it was emotional, but we also made dough. We were able to live. There was a lot of people at those shows. That record sold like crazy. So we were financially fairly comfortable. So me and Rick had a bit of a crisis about it. We're like, we got to start giving back now. And I don't think in some cases other people in our camp were as into that, to the point where it was like the last few gigs, it was just me, Rick, and Steve. And that's where I felt like, okay, we're just hanging on by a thread here. And I'd gotten offered this tour with Tim McGraw, and I just told Rick, we only had two or three more shows on the books for the end of the year, and Rick's like, I don't know what I want to do after that, man. This is getting harder and harder. We don't have the core band. And I'm like, yeah, well, I guess maybe I'll bring this up then. I think I'm going to jump out now. And I got this McGraw tour I want to do, and there's a big arena tour, and it was kind of, I was like, I think I'm just going to do that, man. That's an honest day's pay to me. I don't have to grapple with that. I have to learn my parts, wear clean clothes. You know what I mean? It's like that. I could just do what I do, honestly. And I'm just going to do a kind of a no-brainer gig for 4 or 5 months. It'll get me into a house and a new truck, and I'll just be a dude playing bass. Then I won't have to, be in so much grief and conflict. And so that's kind of where I left it. And I think Rick was bummed at first, and he was totally relieved when we let it go. He had that weight lifted off of him. So we've since gotten together. We've played together. We did a brief kind of little reunion. It didn't really work, but we got together just a few weeks ago. Did Aaron's podcast, and it was great, man. Everything just came right back. It's like, the next thing you know, we're probably not going to, but the next thing you know, it's like, let's get together and kind of jam out some ideas. And, you might or you might not. Everybody's busy. But it all just kind of went right back to where it was. That's the cool thing about those deeper friendships where you've been through that kind of stuff together. You cannot see each other for 5 years, and it's just like a day passed. So that's neat that we still have that relationship. I think it's really interesting that Rich left us in 97. I don't go a week without 3 to 5 emails, questions, or an interview of some sort. And I don't mind. There was a time I was very defensive about it because I thought people were digging. I don't know. It just felt like they were picking at Rich's bones a little too much more than I was comfortable with. It's the spirit of the thing that matters, some people are just being. I just say, I'm not going to answer that question. I'm not going to tell you everything he told me because he wasn't telling me to broadcast it. So there's some things you just got to kind of take to your grave, And they're not even necessarily heavy-duty things, but they're personal. And I never got the impression that he wanted those things broadcast.
There's a tension there as fans or as people that engage with art. On the one hand, it's like, hey man, just engage with the music itself, or engage with someone's books. Like just read the book. At the same time, like you mentioned Mark Twain. Way like 10 hours ago, you mentioned Mark Twain. But part of what makes Mark Twain so cool is his personality. I mean, that's like Hal Holbrook, was that his name? He would like tour around and like impersonate Mark Twain and like do the inflection and do these readings. And so I really feel that tension. Like, so we want to know as much about Mullins as possible. At the same time, at the end of the day, I'm just like, yeah, why? There are some things that are just not for us to know.
There's some things we don't need to know.
Exactly.
Yeah. And if I thought there were certain insights I had that would make any of us the better off for the world knowing, I would say so. But I probably should have never talked about Rich streaking on his last day on Earth, except it's funny. And it's very insightful as to how complex Rich was, And that was a really joyous, weird thing he just had to do. And I think it's beautiful. And if somebody, I can remember the same gig in Lancaster you're talking about. Me and Rick both got a little too forthright with a few things. And some of the church elders and people, they raked us over the coals after the gig.
Oh, really?
And sometimes it's for the dumbest things. Like, I think Rick said something about get your butts out of the seats. And they're like, I don't think you should say that in church. What? Really? Are we all supposed to pretend we don't have butts now? What is, you know what I mean? I was like, if somebody said that to Rich, I can't imagine what he would have done, how he would have gone off on them. I don't remember what we did. We were like, okay, well, don't have us back. I don't know what to say, man. We're kind of a warts and all sort of band, and we hope that the gist of the thing, what you get from it after you take out all the high and low, is something believable and valuable. And if you disagree because of some weird little thing, it's like, God forbid you let Jimmy talk too much. He had the worst Tourette's of any of us. But somehow Jimmy and Rich got away with it because they were so offhanded about it. Me and Rick, there's no way. We can't say one wrong word or people will remember. I don't know why. So it's all in the presentation, I suppose. But, Rich's, some of his political stuff, that last tour, were like, I can't believe what he was getting away with. It's like, there was a brief string. He's saying, like, you religious right people sicken and disgust me. You're an embarrassment. You this and you that. And like,
really?
He's saying this stuff in Dallas. And I'm like, dude, we're in Dallas. This is what you're saying. This part of the world is very much kind of, that cultural Christianity, that religious right thing. And Rich wanted nothing to do with that. I couldn't say it. I couldn't do gigs. And I would say it. I'm saying I can't get away with it. I would be seen as the enemy of the church somehow, where I'm just going, no, I just mean this. But Rich didn't have to explain it. Like for some reason, people went like, yeah, I get that, and they were convicted, and he got away with it in a way that I've never seen anybody be able to pull off. Nor would they even try. Some of those other bands at the time, they wouldn't even. There's no way they would dare say stuff like that. They're too worried about their career. Rich, he just wasn't very good at that, which made him the best at it.
And anyway. We have some other clip. It's from a few years earlier when kind of part of this, you guys did Studio B and with the LaCie Broadcasting. I can't remember, Joe, if this was released officially. So you're going to have to correct me, but he just goes off on the Clintons. And so this is a few years earlier.
This was in like 94.
Yeah. I only bring that up to say that I just think he's a moving target, and he's kind of there to point out the injustices or the evil of who's ever in power. It's almost like that's his job.
Yeah, and it wasn't, if him dissing the Clintons would make somebody think he's right wing, they're mistaken. He didn't vote. He didn't believe Christians should. Now, I disagree with that, or I did at the time, and I still do. But that was his take on things. He said we should leave that to somebody else. He's like, that's their problem. So whoever was in power, he was gonna bag on them.
I saw somebody having an argument about this in like a Rich Mullins Facebook group one time, and I said, well, I think they're trying to make the argument that Rich was on their side politically, and I said, well, I don't think you're getting the big picture here. And I went and I did like 10 minutes of research on Google. Yeah. And I had found a quote by Rich slamming every president back to Johnson.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, you know how the internet is. If you have that confirmation bias thing, and whatever you think you believe, aliens have stolen your luggage, you can find websites to confirm your belief. You know what I mean? No matter how weird it is. And that's kind of like the problem with social media now. It's like there's so much that can confirm your own bias so somebody keeps pulling from the same stupid bias source to prove their point, and then somebody goes from the opposite biased site. You know what I mean? And it's just people yelling at each other. It's just ridiculous. And no one's going to win an argument like that. It shouldn't even be an argument, especially about something as stupid as politics.
Man, Mark, we really appreciate you taking this much time with us. I know this is...
Yeah, it's been great.
I probably should go do some grown-up work. I got a gig tonight, so... There
you go. Hey, I hope you become world famous with prayer flags, so that's great.
Nah, I won't become neighborhood famous with that. But,
yeah.
No,
it's a great record, though, man.
Thank you, brother.
Yeah.
I appreciate it. Yeah, well, just having fun.
All right. We'll see you around.
All right. Take care, guys.
Yep.
You got it. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Well, a big thanks again to Mark Robertson for first doing the interview, and then I don't know what he's going to think when he hears it again, but we're grateful for the time that he gave us. I was pretty astounded to realize that interview was 3 hours long originally, and we're celebrating the Jesus record. We're also celebrating the part that he played in it. Now, we have a little bit of an announcement that we're really excited about, but first let me say this before I get to that announcement. You said to me last week you're getting ready to prepare for this episode, and you were kind of like, man, why didn't Myrrh Records, or whoever owns Myrrh Records now, I couldn't be able to tell you, why didn't they do a reissue of the Jesus record on vinyl? Because that seems kind of obvious. And we there's nothing to say about that other than, hey, you can still do that if you wanted to.
Well, think about this, Chris. This is the 25th anniversary of the Jesus record. And this fall is the 30th anniversary of Liturgy. And seems like we're getting reissues of nothing.
Right. So it's not happening. And I don't know, maybe one day those types of things will happen if somebody figures that out on the legal side and the publishing rights side. But as of now, it's not happening. So be it. Now, we do have an amazing release that was really kind of surprising, because we thought, I wasn't even thinking about this. Now, whose records are being released on vinyl, Joe?
This is pretty exciting. The family of Rick Elias just announced this week, as we're taping this, this past week, that they are doing a series of reissues of his albums on vinyl, and pre-orders are now available for Rick's first album, Rick Elias and the Confessions. Like, you can go online and order that record right now, and we'll tell you how to do that in a moment. There is a catch, though, and that is that this is a very, very limited edition release. They're only making 200 copies of this album on vinyl. I've ordered mine. You ordered yours, correct?
I ordered mine. So I know there's at least a friend of ours, Nate Eichelman's, ordered his. So we know there's only 197 left.
Probably much less than that at this point.
Probably much less.
So if you're listening to us right now and you want that album on vinyl, you've got to get it while it lasts. And it's not going to last long. And you can order that at rickelias.bigcartel.com. rickelias.bigcartel.com, and it'll pop up. It's the only thing in the store right now. Rick Elias and the Confessions limited edition vinyl. It's $30 plus shipping, tax, whatever. But yeah, don't snooze on this one, because this is going to be one of those records that if you miss it, or you're going to hear about it 6 months from now. You'll be listening to this podcast 6 months from now, and you'll be like, how come nobody told me about it? Well, I mean, we tried.
You know, this happened to me recently with a Phil Keaggy album that was released. He just put an album called Beyond Nature, which is this really beautiful kind of acoustic instrumental album that he did. I think it was the late 80s, early 90s. And, you know, I wasn't in the whole, I was like, yeah, I don't know. I didn't have the money at the time to really spend, and I decided not to. It's gone. It's gone now. So, you know, that's what happens, right? We kind of try to take advantage of these things when they happen. And these are pretty independent releases too. So it's them doing it.
You know, when this happened to me, you know what album that the same situation happened to me with, believe it or not? Ironically, it was Rick Elias's Job album. When he did the Job record on Kickstarter, I totally missed it. Like, you know, I mean, just completely missed out on that. Then when I found out, like, I wanted to go online and order the CD, there was no CD to order. It was only available on digital download. So I did that. I bought it as a download, but it was always like kind of disappointing. And so I do have a kind of a nice ending to that story. I wrote Rick, this is, probably 8 years ago. I messaged him on Facebook and I said, hey, Rick, I totally missed out on your Kickstarter. I said, do you have any of the Job CDs laying around? Like, if you have any extras, I'd like to buy one off of you. And he wrote me back and he's just like, what's your address? And I gave him my address. And anyway, like 3 weeks later, he just mailed me the CD as like a gift. He sent it to me and he sent me a signed poster of the album cover too. And I still have that poster hanging up in my living room. I got it framed. And
so you're saying I could have just emailed the guy and gotten a copy.
So yeah, that's how I got my Job. So that CD is very, very special to me. But
yeah, that's really special.
And I would love to have that on vinyl, though you as you pointed out to me, they didn't mention the Job record with the reissues in the announcement. So I'm hoping it ends up on there, because that's one of my favorite albums. Blink is probably my favorite album, which I think you probably agree with. To me that's a classic 90s album. Blink is like a really good, and maybe one day we'll have some episodes about the other Rick albums as they come out on vinyl. Maybe we'll have to do that, which, by the way, we kind of segue into our next episode when we're going to release another episode. We did a part 1 on Rick Elias and the Confessions sometime last year. It was 8 months ago.
8 months ago. It was a little bit of time has elapsed. But
it was, think of it like Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows part 1. And you had to wait another year for part 2. They don't just give it to you back to back.
Yeah, it's been in development. There's been several strikes. We've traveled abroad. The things get delayed.
Yeah, I feel like we're crossing the picket line just doing this podcast right now.
I know we shouldn't even be talking, but we have a part 2. What that means is we recorded a lot about that album, and we decided to split it up into 2 episodes, and we're going to be releasing as a celebration of Rick's album coming out on vinyl, and hopefully get those 200 albums sold, where we are going to release our second episode on Rick Elias and the Confessions.
So we are resurrecting the Between the Songs bump. Is that what you're saying?
That's right. We're going to help them sell at least 10 to 15 more copies. I guarantee.
I'm shooting for 20. I'm reaching for the stars.
That's right.
I'm assuming that all 20 of our listeners are going to go out and buy one after this.
That's right. Yeah. All right. Well, maybe it's good. I now have Deep Valley on vinyl, and I have the Bellsberg album on vinyl, and it'll be good to keep adding to it.
And hey, how about that? We're here. We might as well say, Chris, we made a Rich Mullins record this year.
Buried 2 hours into an episode, right? Yeah, we made a Rich Mullins record in the past year. We went radio silent, didn't we? But we contributed to Deep Valley. Maybe that'll be for another episode or something when we'll talk about that. Well, we'll leave it at that for now. We hope you enjoyed our conversation with Mark, and we have more coming out sometime in the future.
And if you've somehow found this episode before the other one, I should recommend you go on and listen to the Jesus Record 25th anniversary celebration episode of Ragamuffin Archive Revisited. And if anybody's interested, I do that show every Sunday night. Every Sunday night at 9 p.m., we stream a new episode. There's a listening party on YouTube's chat. You can come in, join us, listen to some Rich Mullins music, and chat with some fellow Ragamuffin friends and other fans. And it's a good time. Everybody enjoys themselves. So come on, hang out with us sometime, all right? Give me a like and a subscribe.
All right. Lovely being with you here, and we'll see you next time on Between the Songs.
And happy 25th anniversary to the Jesus Record.